Well, good morning. It's Jenny from Annie and Myra's. It's cold, it's wet, it's overcast. It's a very dreary day here in country Victoria, Australia. So perfect day to hang out and do a bit of slow sewing. So I thought today I'd start going through the Bette bra variation 2 with all the extras, the frill, the self-piping, the binding. I thought I'd start on that today. Now what I've done first is yesterday, because I knew I was going to do this today, I cut out all the fabric pattern pieces and I've hand basted sheer cup lining to the back of all of those fabric pattern pieces except for the back band, which is stretch. If you don't know how I do my hand sewing, you can go to the section under the Bette bra on hand sewing. So the first thing I've done is pin the two lower cups together, the lower cup pieces, the inner cup and the middle cup there, and I'm going to stitch that with a 1/4 inch seam, then press it around the curve of a tailor's ham, and then we're going to do the piping. So I'm going to go down onto the table from here on in. But how beautiful is this fabric, by the way? That's from Joel & Sons in the UK, which is not cheap, but you only need a little bit. So anyway, I'll get back to you down on the table. So I've stitched that cup together and then I've ironed that flat over the curve of the tailor's ham. I meant to say this is a silk crepe de chine, which is a woven that's beautiful, but I actually just have pinned and basted the sheer cup lining to the back to give it a bit more stability. And now I've cut out the sections for the self-bind and for the piping. I just did them all at once while I was there. I meant to say, now this, I've cut this on the bias. The main thing I wanted to say is here I've actually used a good quality polyester satin. I find it's much easier to work with a good quality poly. Or a silk satin that's got a tiny little bit of stretch in it will work a lot better too than a pure silk satin for a lot of these bindings and pipings. So this pipings, the actual strip, I cut 3 centimeters wide, which is a 1 1/4 inches, and I've cut 2 for the self bind at the same time. And I'm actually now pinning the piping cord inside the bind, and I just stagger the pins like that to hold the tension, and then I'm going to stitch that. So when you stitch that in, we're going to get a and I'm going to have to change the thread to a different color, but we're going to get the presser foot. I'll show you here. So we're going to use this presser foot, the zipper foot, offset the needle right to the left so we can push that right up against the piping cord. So even better, I set up my second sewing machine so I can run 2 different colors at once. And I've done the piping. You can see I've got the piping cord there. And also this is wider than the 1/4 inch seam, so I'm now going to trim that back. Yeah, it's just much easier to handle if you've got, if it's a bit wider. So now I'm going to actually trim that back to a 1/4 inch. So just to trim that back to a 1/4 inch along there. Next, I'm pinning the typing to the top there, and you can see I've left an overhang there, just makes it easier for handling. And I'm actually pinning it a bit around the curve because I don't want it to create extra tension. And also I've put these pattern pieces there so I know I've got the right side up, because I've done this before where I've pinned it to the wrong side of the cup, or actually even stitched it. So I wanted to be sure I was going to the top rather than the Y line. So next, again, we're going to stitch right up against using the presser foot with a needle offset right to the left, and stitch all along that edge there. Oh, and as I might have said before, I leave all my ends long here. I don't use the automatic needle cutter, and I'm going to put the needle down here and then pull the threads from the back, which helps stop this going down the needle plate. Now that that's done, we're just going to mark the line where this notch is with the air erasable pen. That notch then matches against this seam allowance here. And then we're going to pin that, and again stitch a 1/4 inch seam butting right up against the piping cord. Pin that. Now you might remember that usually we will actually be doing an enclosed seam here where we'll have a separate shear cup lining attached and fold that over. I'm actually not doing that because with this particular example, because we're later going to do a self-bind and a ruffle, I'm going to do a completely separate inner lining in this gorgeous satin on the inside. Once I've stitched that, I'll usually just open it out and check that I've got it completely. You can see here it's not quite matching closely enough, so I'll just go back and try and go a bit closer again to that edge. This is looking so gorgeous. Now I don't normally iron that, I just finger press it because I don't really want the line showing from behind, like the line of the you know, the piping cord and everything. And I also don't trim it anymore either because I just don't, having said all that, I don't normally trim it, but I'm going to trim this back just a little bit so you don't see the purple coming through from the other side. The reason I don't usually trim it that much is I don't want to reduce the integrity of the seam. So I've just trimmed back that purple, which should be fine anyway because I've got that extra stitch layer. I'm so fussy sometimes. So next we're going to actually attach the power bar. So I've pulled out the power bar paper piece so that I can mark that I know that this line here goes to that line, but this line here goes to where we're going, the top of the lower cup and then that seam. So I know that if I mark this here, that's where my seam is. And I'm going to then pin that point to where that seam will be. Now we also need to organise to take out some of that excess piping cord now. So we know that that goes there, but we also want to reduce some of this piping cord so that it sits back behind the seam here so that it doesn't create bulk in that seam. If we now if we just trimmed it, I vary on how I do this, but essentially what I'm going to do is cut that there, pull this out. Now it should be, theoretically it should be 6 mil, but because it retracts a bit when you pull it, I usually do that 10 mil. And then because it will retract behind, that means it's then sitting just behind that seam. Then I've replaced that back at the seam, which goes, the notch goes where the seam is, so with the piping on the other side. You can actually completely remove the piping cord if you like, if you want to reduce the volume and not have the bulk, and just have the actual binding, the purple part, not the actual cord. So I'm now pinning this again, try to pin around the curve. So you can see I've pinned that around the curve because I'm trying not to have any tension on that seam. And now I'm going to stitch that seam. So now that that's done, we're going to move on to the neckline. Now, I'm not going to trim and grade that seam. Same reason I was talking about before. I don't want to reduce the integrity of the seam. So, and I'm not going to press it because I don't want to get a line. I just finger press that as I'm going along doing other things. So now we want to actually do the self bind on the neckline and then the neckline ruffle. But because this is just, I just try to just stabilize it a little bit. So I want to stitch this to the inside. Now I'm using this gorgeous silk ribbon that I get die matched from Bra Builders, but you could also just use a sheer cup lining cut on the straight grain, not on the bias, because this becomes on the bias a bit here. So I'm actually going to pin that all along, and then what I do is stitch that sort of as a stay stitch. I stitch it with just under that 6mm that we're going to attach the self bind later. So I'm just going to stitch that, as I said, just under, so at about 5mm all along there, and then we're going to do the self bind. Oh, and I meant to say I usually extend those edges about 15mm, which is 5/8 of an inch, just because it's easier later to be able to sew the self bind to the end there, easier for handling. So next I'm pinning the self bind to there, now with the right sides together, extending out into the tape as I've said, and just sort of, I can't say it any other way, just what's the word, easing it around the corner there. Yeah, see, easing that around the corner. It's really helpful that we've got this line of that ribbon there. It makes it easier to be able to sew it exactly at, because shortly I'm going to stitch that at 6mm, which is just outside that stay stitch line. So now I've stitched that row, I'm now going to just press that seam allowance towards the binding, and at the same time that I'm doing that, I'm going to press the outside seam allowance down 1/4 of an inch. So next what we can do is just roll that tape to the bind to the inside against the tape there. Don't iron it because it just creates a nicer look if it's just rolled in. We want to try and get it, we're going to pin from the inside here, and this is why it's handy to have that extension there. It just makes it much easier to handle. Oh, whoops. Just, as I said, it's much easier to have that extension there, much easier to handle. And then we're going to keep rolling that in and pinning it. Pin, pin, and then you want to actually check that it's all even from the right side, and I can already tell that it's not quite even there, so I need to move this up a little bit. Of course, I do use it. Doing it in purple is going to make it more obvious if it's not quite even, but anyway. So we're going to move all the way along there and check that we've got that even, and then we're going to stitch with a tiny little back stitch to the back, which I'll show you when I finish pinning. Now, just before I'm going to hand stitch that, but while I've got the iron set up, I'm actually going to measure to cut out the fabric ruffles. So the fabric ruffle needs to be, it's gathered twice, so it needs to be 2 times this width plus a 2 centimeter turn under at each long end. So I've measured the neckline edge to be 24 centimeters, which doubled is 48 centimeters, and then 2 lots of 2 centimeters, which makes it 52 centimeters long. So I've marked out 2 lots of 5 centimeters wide, and then I need to make that 52 centimeters long. So now I've cut those 2 ruffles that are going to go behind there. I don't know why I have such an aversion to cutting up long oblong pieces of fabric, but I always do. So next I'm going to hand stitch this to the back, and just for those that may not have picked up before, I usually use a Sharps 9 or a Betweens quilting needle, and then for my little stitch knot here, I wind 1, 2, 3, 4, and then come back and wind in the opposite direction at the top, pull that through, and that's a tiny little, what's called, I think, a smocker's knot. Then I'm going to come in behind here and starting from way back here, so that you can keep that stable. Doesn't so much matter here because that's not going to show later, so I'm just going to secure that edge, and of course it will catch when I'm sewing on the video. So I'm just going to do a tiny narrow back stitch. So for that, once I've got, and I need to keep checking the other side to check I'm not coming through on the other side all the time, and I also need to check all the time that I've got that width the same on the other side all the time. But for a narrow back stitch, I just go back a tiny little bit, run through the seam allowance, and then ensure I haven't caught on the other side, and pull through. Same again, tiny little back stitch, run through behind, and pull through, checking all the time I'm keeping this width even, and also that I'm not coming through on the other side. I came through on the other side then, so coming through the seam allowance, still keep coming through on the other side. Excellent. Keep going, back stitch through the seam, making sure you're not coming through on the other side. And making sure that you can see that's even. Sometimes when you're just doing it, if it's spread out by a pin or something, it'll look wider than it is. But you can see we're still going, and that's still quite even. So I'm going to finish that and then come back to do the ruffle with you. For the ruffle, I've pressed under 1 centimetre on each end, folded, you can see I've folded that in half there, and then I'm pinning all the way around. And while I'm pinning that, I'm just going to discuss, you could to gather it, you could use a row of gathering stitches, a double row. I find it actually the easiest way for me to do this is to get the overlocker and overlock it, but have the differential feed set at 1.5. Now we're going to actually pull it up to 2, but I find it's easiest if I have it set at 1.5 and then pull it up to fit the actual width of the neckline manually. And I'm going to show you how I do that shortly once I've actually attached, I've done the overlock. The reason I like the overlock is because I've then got a line that's very easy to follow that I can then place behind the bind that we've made. So once you've finished your overlock, what you want to do is you'll see there's the two upper loopers that are forming a line across the front there. I'm going to pick those out there, and then I'm going to use that to gather. Now it's just a little bit tricky fiddly going past the seam at the start, sorry, not the seam, the turn under at the start. So just be a bit careful there, and then gradually, very carefully, gather up this, and we're going to gather it up to fit the neckline, and I'll come back to you when I've got that nearly ready to pin to the back of the neckline. So I've gathered up those gathers on the frill. What I've done is tied off the ends at one end. That end, front end, is going to sit behind, but it needs to sit behind. I've put a pin there where the seam allowance is, because that's where the bridge is going to get stitched down like that. So that's at 6mm seam allowance, and I've started to pin there. Then at the other end, because I'm doing the wider strap attachment, I've marked where that other end needs to finish, which is there, and I've started to pin there. Then I've roughly measured it so it's the right width, and then I'm going to even out the gathers, and then I'm pinning behind there so that this, sorry, the seam allowance is sitting behind the bind and having it roughly even when I've pinned it, and then I'll make it more even when I'm stitching it. So now I've got all that pinned, I'm actually going to, I've threaded up with the yellow because this is going to be stitched in the front. I'm going to do what I call a stitch in the ditch, which is where I stitch in that ditch right there where the I've got quite a lot of pins there, and the reason I've got quite a lot of pins there is I'm trying to keep this straight, and I've got it sitting behind that 6mm seam allowance, so I can take that pin out now. And I'm going, so coming back again in behind, stitch in the ditch, tiny little stitch, okay, coming behind there, stitch in the ditch, and then a tiny little back stitch, coming through, stitch in the ditch again. And the whole time I'm doing this, I'm spreading out and making sure I've got that ruffle even in height from behind that purple bind. You can see I've come in again, stitch in the ditch. So we're going back a tiny little bit and then forward. All the time spreading to check we've got the gathers even and the height there behind even visually. Back stitch, forward, back stitch a tiny little bit, forward, in the ditch, and then remove that pin. So you can see you can't see from the front where I'm going, but I'm able to make sure I've got it all even at the front. I'm going to keep going on that and come back when I've got to the other end. Now that I've finished that, I'm just going to catch this, the end to hold it straight without showing on the other side, just to hold that end there straight, and then I'll do the same at the bridge. So I'm just holding that together straight. And then I'll just do the same at the bridge, just to hold it up straight. So you can see that's all done now. And then this actually is finally finished, this cup, except for what I'm going to do now is cut out a lining out of the purple satin, and I'm going to show you how we're going to stitch that together and attach it to the inside. And that's the cup, then the cup's finished.